where we can certainly apply creative systems, and they have been applied. This is an example of an automated painter, so an application to the visual arts, and this is certainly an example of somewhere where existing techniques in AI and computer graphics can be brought to bear. But of course, there's more than that needs to go into it, or more than that you'd expect from such a system. And in this case, this system's using emotion detection of human subjects to inspire its painting, to motivate the way it composes its scenes and decides on a style and so on. And I've already mentioned video games, computer games as being a really exciting domain for applying creative systems. So you can imagine games that dynamically adapt as the game goes along, maybe modeling the state of the user in some way and adapting to that, maybe introducing some sort of topical element to the games. And that's something that's a sort of work in progress by various people and has been studied quite a bit already. So I said I'm not going to talk that much about the philosophical arguments today, but it's worth just mentioning a few things, a few of the things that the people are thinking about or have thought about. I mentioned already rejecting the Turing test as a way of evaluating, and so that of course raises the question of how we do evaluate systems. The Turing test is an obvious target simply because it's the sort of standard answer that people come up with as soon as you start thinking about evaluation of creative systems. So there's been a lot of discussion developing how notions such as intentionality and imagination apply once you're talking about creative systems rather than creative humans. Can you apply these notions in the same way? Does it make sense, and how are they different? And that's been discussed a great deal. Something I'm going to talk about later quite a bit today is the idea that we can take a descriptive theoretical model of what humans do and explore it by implementing it and seeing what happens. And so I'll be in the second half of the talk, I'll be talking about a specific example of this. And this is something that people have been doing in various ways over the last 10 years. And I've mentioned already that we don't necessarily want to be using just the output of a system in order to evaluate it. And that's also something that's been discussed fairly extensively. So before I go on, I'm going to just make a brief aside on a subject which I think is worth bringing up. So in traditional artificial intelligence or machine learning, we're generally trying to model some sort of common or typical characteristics of whatever the system is that we're modeling. So this might be language or semantics or whatever it is. So we're trying to learn how to predict things that we've on the basis of what we've seen before. And you might immediately think, well, why do we want to? Why this is surely no longer relevant when we're talking about creative generation, creative systems. But actually, there are a couple of reasons why that's not the case. So firstly, in a creative work, typically the novel or creative part of the work is packed up in things that do conform to our expectations, and that's exactly how it has its impact. So very often, it's the surprising parts are in contrast to something that does actually conform to our expectations. So, for example, this Magritte painting. Most of the painting is actually really quite uninteresting. There's very little unexpected about the painting, and it's you might argue exactly that makes it have such a great impact, that there's something very unexpected right in the middle of it. And the second thing is that in order for the system to be able to diverge in a meaningful way from the norms of what it's doing, it needs to know what they are. It needs to have a good model of them to start with, so that it knows what expectations it's violating and can model how humans might respond to that. So, for example, Picasso's movement were challenging the norms of painting, whereas the painting on the right was done by monkeys. So I'm now going to talk a bit about the project that I'm working on at the moment. So this is an EU project involving collaboration between 5 different institutions spread across Europe. And it's called the What If Machine. So you can think of a lot of creative ideas as in terms of a small fictional alteration to the world as we know it. These are the sorts of things that you might be able to express in a what-if question. So what if all humans had wings, for example? And it's this sort of nutshell of an idea that lies at the heart of a lot of stories or films or paintings or other creative works. And so this doesn't apply, of course, to all creative works, but it's something that that you can. It's a way of analysing a lot of creative or artistic works. A couple of examples. This is a great cartoon. I love this. In case you can't read that, it says the real reason dinosaurs became extinct. And so you can think of this as having a what-if idea embedded into it. This is a sort of historical, alternative interpretation of history, or alternative history. And it's actually by analysing that what-if that you actually get to the heart of what this cartoon's about. And so here's an explicit example. What if there was a boy who never grew up, and he could fly? And you can imagine lots of stories that might come from that, including some familiar ones. So this sort of way of thinking of this particular subset of creative ideas gives us raises some interesting questions. So what is it that makes these ideas interesting in cases where we do consider them to be interesting? And can we automatically generate ideas that are interesting, or select the interesting ideas from a bag of perhaps largely mediocre ideas? What sort of resources do we need in order to do that, either as humans or as a system? What kind of knowledge does it rely on? What sort of reasoning do you need to be able to do? And what processes could be involved, must be involved, could be involved would be a better way to put it, in producing these things or critically evaluating them. If we can generate these things automatically, can we just use them straight off? So one way to get some partial answers to some of these questions is to take this computational approach. So we can propose some plausible process, what we consider to be a plausible architecture of the process that could be going on in generating the ideas. And we can try implementing it, and then maybe by looking at where our implementation falls over and what its requirements are, where it succeeds, we might learn something about maybe about the plausibility of this process, and something more about creative generation. And of course, to the extent that our implementation does succeed in producing interesting ideas, we can probably use them in some way. So in this project, then, we're proposing a computational model of one specific kind of creativity. And there's a key idea that, the project embodies, which is the idea of critical evaluation. This is usually evaluation of within the system by evaluating the narrative potential of ideas. And in particular, trying to get at this by doing narrative generation. So if we take an example, what if there was a little girl whose dad was an accountant? I think you'll probably agree that's not a very interesting idea. On the other hand, what if there was a little girl whose dad was a robber chief? Then you can imagine a few more stories coming out of that. And so the idea is that we take this approach, we sort of try to think about what stories or what narratives could follow from an idea, and see if we can get a handle on whether things may constitute good ideas by doing that. So this is the sort of overall architecture of our model, and I'm going to step through this just to break it down. So the system will get input from some source. So that might just be a query entered by a user, or it might be coming from social media or some sort of topical news source. And on the basis of that, it's going to build what we call a worldview. So this is some collection of knowledge that the system considers to be relevant for the subject that it's been asked to come up with ideas for. And it will do this by using large knowledge bases or semantic resources of the sort that we're working on, that the current technology offers or could offer. And then on the basis of that worldview, it generates some fictional ideas. This is the step that's referred to as ideation. And so it probably will generate a whole load of these, some of which will be good and some of which won't. It'll then perform narrative generation on the basis of those ideas. So it will try to generate narratives that follow from the ideas. And on the basis of what it manages to produce from narrative generation, it will try to make a decision via some machine learning system about whether it thinks the ideas are good or not. And at this stage, it might go back and decide that its worldview wasn't good enough or wasn't appropriate and change that. Or it might just go back and say, can I have some more ideas? Because none of those were any good. And eventually, when it's happy that it's got a good idea, it'll realize it in some form that humans can evaluate and output it. So this might be a story or a poem or whatever. It's worth just noting that although we're doing narrative generation in here, we're not necessarily generating narratives at the end. So a story is one possible output from the system, but it could even be a painting or a cartoon, as we've seen already. So the two really key parts of this, in a sense, are the fictional idea generation or ideation, and the narrative generation step. Well, it turns out that the generating ideas of this form is actually quite an easy thing to do. It's quite easy to generate a very large set of reasonably good ideas with some good ones in there, because we're just doing this by making small changes to our worldview. The difficult bit is this narrative generation step. And that's partly because narrative generation is a difficult thing to do. It is a reasonably well-studied field, quite extensively studied field, but it's nevertheless difficult, and it's far from being a solved problem. Okay, so the main hypothesis of the project is that there will be some sort of metrics that we can get from the output of this narrative generation system that will serve as good predictors for the quality of the idea. So we've got our ideation engine producing all of these ideas, and most of these are going to be rubbish, or at least not very exciting, and then occasionally we might get a good one coming out. So each of these ideas is going to feed into our narrative generation system, and it will try to produce as many narratives as it can. So these aren't necessarily stories, but they're a slightly more abstract representation that the system uses for what's going on in a narrative. And it will then output some selection of metrics. So this could be things like simply the number of different narratives that it can generate, or maybe some measure of the variety of those narratives, or some sort of measure of their quality. These metrics then feed into our machine learning model, which tries to learn a model to predict a quality score for these ideas. And the system then uses that to filter out the bad ideas and choose the good ones. So we're talking about a supervised machine learning task here. So that is, we're going to have human judgment, actual human judgments of a lot of ideas, and the model is going to try to learn from that its model of what constitutes good or bad ideas. So at this stage, we're not actually committed to what these metrics are that we get from narrative generation. Really, our aim at this point is just to get lots of them, and then let the machine learning model decide which ones are good predictors. So this is, as I said already, that the actual ideation part is quite easy to do, and it's this narrative generation loop that's difficult. So one of the things that we really need to do on the project is to get the narrative generation systems in a state where they can generate these metrics that are going to be meaningful. And I'll talk in a moment about the challenges of doing that. So one of the things that, or really the key thing that stands in the way of good narrative generation at the moment is various types of knowledge that it relies on having representations of to string together its narrative.